At 7 in the morning, my granddaughter called me from her mother's house 3 miles down the road, and the first thing she said wasn't hello. "Grandpa," she whispered, "don't wear your silver ring today, the one Grandma gave you. Please." I had the ring in my hand already. I'd been standing at the bathroom sink, the way I do every morning, sliding it onto my finger the same way I had for 31 years. It was the last thing I put on before I walked out the door. Always had been. "Sweetheart, what are you talking about?" I said. "Just please don't wear it, don't take it out of the house today." She was 9 years old. I didn't know whether to laugh or worry. "Okay," I told her, because what else do you say to a 9-year-old with a shaky voice at 7 in the morning? "Okay, I won't wear it." I set it back on the edge of the sink. I looked at it for a long moment, the worn silver band, the small turquoise stone my wife had pressed into the jeweler's hand herself, the way the light caught it in the morning. Then I walked out to feed the horses. By noon, I understood why she called. "My name is Walter." No, wait, let me start further back, because none of what happened makes sense without knowing where I came from. I'm 67 years old. I spent 40 of those years running a small horse boarding and operation outside Bozeman, Montana. Not a big outfit, never was. 8 stalls, a round pen, about 40 acres of pasture that my wife and I bought in 1989 when land out here was still something a working man could afford. We raised our son there. We buried our dog there. My wife, Lorraine, we lost her to pancreatic cancer 6 years ago, and I'll tell you plainly, the only reason I didn't sell everything and disappear is because of the horses and because of my granddaughter. My son, I'll call him my son because that's what he is to me. Even now, he's 41, a decent man underneath everything, a man who got tangled up with the wrong woman and spent 4 years too confused to find his way out. His wife, my daughter-in-law, I'll call her what she was, a problem. Her name was Celeste. She was smart, I'll give her that. The kind of smart that walks into a room and immediately starts calculating what's in it and who it belongs to. She said my son had been married 6 years when Lorraine passed. I didn't think much about Celeste one way or another back then. She was polite enough at the funeral. She brought a casserole. She hugged me in the parking lot and told me that if I ever needed anything at all, I should just call. I should have noticed, even then, that she looked around the property while she said it. I had the ring appraised once, just out of curiosity, maybe 3 years after Lorraine passed. The jeweler in Bozeman told me it was worth about $4,000. The turquoise was genuine, good quality. The silver work was hand-done by a Navajo artisan my wife had found at a market in Santa Fe on our 25th anniversary trip. I thanked him and drove home and put it back on my finger and didn't think about the number again. I should have thought about it more. The trouble started, as near as I can piece it together, about 8 months before my granddaughter's phone call. My son and Celeste had been having money problems. I didn't know the details, but I heard enough through phone calls and through what my granddaughter said without meaning to say. Something about a refinance. Something about his contracting business slowing down. The kind of financial stress that makes people look sideways at things they never looked at before. Celeste started coming around the property more. Just to visit, she'd say. Just to bring my granddaughter out to see the horses. Nothing unusual in that, nothing I could point to and say, there, that's when it started. But looking back now, she was measuring things. She was doing the math. She brought it up for the first time in March. My son was there, sitting at my kitchen table, and Celeste said, so casually, so lightly, the way you might mention the weather, "You know, bud, a lot of families in your situation do a property transfer early, keeps things simple later, avoids probate." I looked at her. "I'm 65, I said. "I'm not exactly drawing up a will this afternoon." She laughed. My son looked at his coffee. That was March. By June, she was saying it differently, less casual, more specific. She'd started bringing documents, printouts from websites, things that looked official but weren't, talking points about living trusts and transfer on death deeds and what happened to small agricultural properties in Montana when an owner died without a plan. She was using words like burden and estate tax and protection, and she was directing all of it at my son, not at me, in a tone that suggested the whole thing was an act of love. I'd spent 40 years training horses. The main thing I learned working with horses is that pressure applied steadily and from one direction will eventually move anything. That's what she was doing to my son, steady pressure. One direction. For months, my son brought it to me himself on a Thursday evening in late August. He sat in the same kitchen chair he'd sat in when he was 12 years old and told me he'd broken the truck window with a baseball, and he had almost the same expression on his face, that particular combination of guilt and necessity. "Dad," he said, "Celeste thinks we should talk about the property." "I know she does," I said. "She's found an attorney. She thinks if we just structure things now while you're healthy." "I am healthy. I know you are." I'm 65 years old and I rode 4 horses last week and I haven't been to a doctor for anything other than a checkup in 3 years. I know, Dad, so what exactly is the hurry? He didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, he had Celeste's answer, which wasn't the same thing. I didn't sign anything that night. I told him I'd think about it, and I did think about it. I thought about it for a week, and then I made an appointment with my own attorney, a woman named Patricia Held who'd handled my affairs for 11 years, and I told her everything Celeste had said. Patricia listened with her hands folded on her desk, and when I was done she said, "Don't sign anything she puts in front of you. Not without me reviewing it first." I promised her I wouldn't. I almost kept that promise. The document appeared in October. My son brought it over on a Sunday afternoon and Celeste was with him, and they brought my granddaughter, which I realize now is not an accident. It's harder to have a hard conversation when there's a 9-year-old in the room drawing horses on a notepad. It was a transfer agreement, property and assets, the 40 acres, the operation, and in a clause I almost missed on the 3rd page, personal property of significant value including jewelry and collectibles. That clause was new. That clause had not been in any of the earlier conversations. "What is this?" I asked, pointing to it. Celeste said it was standard language. She said her attorney had included it for completeness. She said it didn't mean anything specific, it was just a catch-all. I was tired. I am going to say that plainly because it matters. I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. I was tired of the conversation, tired of 6 months of pressure, tired of watching my son sit in the chair and look at his coffee instead of at me. And my granddaughter was in the other room singing something to herself, and the house felt very quiet in the way it had felt quiet since Lorraine died. And I thought, what does it matter? He's my son. It goes to him eventually anyway. I signed it. I signed a document I had not had reviewed by my attorney in my own kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in October because I was lonely and tired and I wanted the conversation to be over. By Monday morning I knew I'd made a mistake. I called Patricia first thing Monday. She had the document by noon. By 2 o'clock she called me back and her voice was different, careful in the way voices get when the news is not good. "This agreement as written gives your son and his spouse joint authority over the property transfer and all enumerated assets," she said. "The personal property clause is not standard language. It was added deliberately. And there's a competency provision in Section 4 that I want you to read very carefully." "A what?" "A clause that allows either party, your son or his spouse, to initiate a competency review if they believe the grantor is unable to manage his own affairs. If that review is initiated, the transfer can be executed without your further signature." I sat down. "Patricia," I said, "how do I undo this?" "We challenge it," she said, "on the grounds that the language was misrepresented to you and that you signed without independent counsel. You'll need to document everything, every conversation, every document she gave you, dates and specifics, and I need you to not say anything to them yet. Can you do that?" I told her I could. I hung up the phone and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Outside the window the horses were moving across the pasture in the thin October light, the way they always do in the afternoon, easy and unhurried. Lorraine used to stand at that window and watch them. She called it the best part of the day. I thought about the ring. I thought about that clause. Personal property of significant value including jewelry and collectibles. She'd been in this house dozens of times. She knew about the ring. She'd heard the appraisal story. I'd told it at dinner once. The way you tell a story about something that delights you, not something you think you need to protect. I'd told it like a man with nothing to hide, because I'd had nothing to hide, until now. The competency filing came in November, 11 days after I called Patricia. My son's name was on it, but the language was Celeste's. I could tell by the phrases, the particular way she'd arranged the words to sound caring while meaning something else entirely. The filing claimed I had shown signs of confusion and impaired judgment, that I had made several large financial decisions without understanding their implications, and that an independent review was warranted to ensure I was protected. They were using my signature against me. The very document I'd signed to stop the pressure had become the evidence of my confusion. My son called me the night the filing was served. He sounded miserable. "Dad, I want you to know this wasn't. Was it her idea?" I asked. Long pause. "It's for your protection," he said. But he said it the way you say words that belong to someone else. "Son," I said, "I love you. And I need you to understand that what is happening right now is not protection. I need you to think very carefully about whose interests are being served here, and I need you to do that thinking on your own, without her in the room." He didn't say anything. "I'll be fine," I told him. "I've been fine for 65 years, but I am going to fight this." The hearing was scheduled for February. Patricia worked through December and January building the case. Correspondence, witness statements from my veterinarian, my farrier, my neighbors who'd watched me run the property for 4 decades. She subpoenaed the original document and had a handwriting analyst examine the datings on certain clauses. She found what she'd suspected. The personal property language had been inserted after earlier drafts, and the notarization date didn't match the document's internal references. It had been altered. She also found that Celeste had contacted a real estate broker in September, a full month before I signed anything, to get a preliminary valuation on the property. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A full month before I signed, she was already talking to a buyer. The competency hearing itself lasted 2 days. I sat in a courtroom in Gallatin County and answered questions from a court-appointed psychologist, and I'll admit to you, there is something that does something to a man, sitting in a room while strangers discuss whether his mind still works. I was not confused. I had never been confused, but I had to prove that, and the proving of it required me to sit quietly while Celeste's attorney suggested, in careful legal language, that a man who signs a document he doesn't fully understand might be a man whose judgment has slipped. Patricia demolished that argument in about 40 minutes. She put the altered document on the screen. She walked through the timeline: September broker call, October signing, November filing. She called my veterinarian, who testified that I had managed a complex equine health crisis in December with full clarity and competence. She called my neighbor, who'd known me for 22 years, and said quietly and without flourish, "I have never once questioned that man's mind." And then she called my granddaughter. I didn't know she was going to do that. Patricia had mentioned it as a possibility, and I'd said I didn't want to put a 9-year-old in a courtroom, and Patricia had nodded and then done it anyway, and I have thanked her for it every day since. My granddaughter sat in the witness chair in a blue dress her grandmother would have loved, and she answered the questions in her clear, steady voice, and she said this. She said that the previous October, a few days before the Sunday I signed the document, she had been in Celeste's car when Celeste made a phone call. She said she'd been in the back seat with her headphones in, but the music wasn't playing. And she heard Celeste tell whoever was on the phone that the ring alone is worth clearing $4,000. And there's more where that came from once the old man signs and we get a review started. She'd been sitting in the back of that car for 4 months holding that sentence. She was 9 years old and she held it by herself because she didn't know what it meant exactly, but she knew enough to know it was wrong. And on the morning she heard I was going to town, to the same jewelry store where I'd had the ring appraised. She called me and asked me not to take it. She didn't want the ring to leave the house before she could figure out how to tell someone what she'd heard. She told Patricia. She told her the week before the hearing. The courtroom was very quiet when she finished. The judge dismissed the competency petition. He did more than dismiss it. He used the word frivolous in his written ruling, which Patricia told me is not a word judges use lightly. He referred the altered document to the county attorney for further review. Celeste's attorney filed for a continuance on 3 separate motions and was denied on all 3. My son was in the hallway when the ruling came down. I found him sitting on a bench outside the courtroom and he looked like a man who had walked into a wall he hadn't seen coming. I sat down next to him and neither of us said anything for a while. "I didn't know about the phone call," he finally said. "I know," I said. "I didn't know she'd altered." "I know, son." He put his face in his hands. He's 41 years old and he sat there with his face in his hands the way he had when he was 8, and I put my hand on the back of his neck the same way I had then. "This is going to be all right," I said. Not because I knew it certainly, but because I believed it, and because I wanted him to start believing it too. Celeste left in March. I won't say more about that than necessary. It's his life, and he's living it. And by last spring, he was spending 3 weekends a month at the property helping me with the horses and talking to my granddaughter about anything she wanted to talk about, which is usually horses, and also occasionally a television show involving horses, and sometimes whether horses could theoretically be trained to open a refrigerator. He's still her father. He's still my son. The ring is on my finger right now. I put it on this morning the way I do every morning, slid it onto my left hand, felt the weight of it settle the way it always settles. My granddaughter asked me about it last weekend, asked if I still thought about what happened, and I told her the truth. I think about it the way you think about a scar, not with anger mostly, with a kind of clear-eyed knowledge that you didn't have before. She nodded like that made sense to her. 9-year-olds understand more than we credit them for. I've learned that the hard way, and I've also learned it the best possible way. There are people who looked at me and saw a number. They saw 65 years old and they calculated the distance between me and the finish line and they decided to get a head start on what they assumed was already theirs. They mistook my patience for passivity. They mistook my quiet for weakness. They mistook my love for my son for a vulnerability they could use. And in doing so, they made the single largest miscalculation of their lives. Because I had spent 40 years learning one thing above all else: the quietest animal in the pasture is not always the most docile one. Sometimes it's the one that knows exactly where it's standing and is simply waiting to see what you'll do next. I knew. I watched. I waited. And when the moment came, it wasn't me who spoke up first. It was a 9-year-old girl in a blue dress who had been sitting in the back of a car with her music turned off, listening to every word.